Here again is the sitemap with our defined route states. The states correspond to a specific place in the application. Each state defines the view, the controller associated with that view, and other state properties. When the defined state is activated, the associated view is displayed within the tag marked with the UI view directive, and the associated controller is executed. The routes are configured in the application using the UI router's $state-provider service. The $state-provider service provides a state method for defining the states. Each state includes a name and an object. Use the object properties to define the parameters for the state. The URL property defines the URL fragment identifier associated with this state. By associating a URL with a state, you get deep linking. Deep linking reflects where the user is in the application. This ensures that the browser's forward and back buttons behave as expected, and the user can bookmark or email links to locations within the application. The template URL property defines the path to the HTML template containing the HTML elements for the view. This template is then displayed in the HTML element that contains the UI-view directive. The controller property is optional. It defines the string name of the controller associated with the defined view. Since the controller is registered with the module, the $state-provider can locate the controller by its name. Since we are using the controller as syntax for managing scope in the application, as discussed earlier in this course, we are adding the as and an alias here. There are additional object properties available for defining more complex states. Check out the UI router documentation for the full list of properties. Now that we know what a state looks like, let's configure the state for our product list view. Here we are back in WebStorm. We will add the route state configuration for the entire application in the app.js file. Let's start by adding the route state for just the product list view. To set up the states, we'll use the Angular application's main module. We're referencing it here with the app variable, and we'll call the config method. So app.config. The config method takes one parameter, which is the function that defines the configuration code. We'll want to pass the $state-provider service into that function. And since we want to make this code safe for minification, we'll actually pass an array into this configuration method. The first element of the array is the string name of each parameter we're going to pass into the function. We're only going to pass $state-provider. The second element of the array is then the function itself. And we're going to pass to the function the $state-provider. Angular will then inject this $state-provider service into this function for us. Now we are ready to use the $state-provider and call the state method to set up our first state. So I'm just going to paste in the code from the slide. This code defines a state named product list. It sets the URL fragment identifier for the state to /products. It specifies the URL defining the location of the HTML file that contains the view template. When this state is activated, this template is fetched from the web server if it has not already been downloaded. The HTML from the defined template is then inserted into the layout template at the location defined with the UI-view directive. This code also specifies the associated controller. When this state is activated, the defined controller is constructed. Will our application run now? Let's give it a try. Nope, we don't have any code that activates that state. But we associated a URL of /products for this state. So if we add /products to the URL. Bang! The routing found our view, and the mocking framework picked up the data requested, providing our mocked data. The application is working again. When we ran the application, we had no initial page displayed. That's because our routing does not define a default route state. A default route state provides a fallback state for use when no other state is activated. We can define a default state using the URL router provider service. The URL router provider service watches $location for changes to the URL. When $location changes, it runs through the list of state rules one by one until a match is found. Then it activates that state. It is used behind the scenes whenever you specify a URL in a state configuration. For our purposes, URL router provider provides an otherwise method for defining a default URL. In this code, the default URL fragment identifier is /products, which will activate the product list state. Let's set up a default route now. We are back in WebStorm with the app.js file open. We need Angular to also inject the $URL router provider service into this configuration method, so we can add it as a function parameter. We'll just put it here. We'll also need to add the parameter to the min-safe array. Then we can use the otherwise method of $URL router provider to identify the default URL. We'll put that as the first line of the function. This line of code says that if an activated state has no entry here in this function, or if there is no active state, then display the state associated with the /products URL fragment identifier. Looking here, that's the product list state. So let's run the application again. Now it automatically navigates to #/products and displays our product list. Cool, we're rolling with some routes here. Now that the routing is configured, let's look at the 3 basic ways to activate a route and navigate to a view. One option is to navigate to the state's URL. That's how we displayed the product list view. We defined a default URL, and UI Router navigated to that URL. This activated the state and displayed the associated view. Another option is to activate a state with code using $state.go. $state.go activates the defined state. We'll use $state.go later in this course. Another option is to click a link that contains a UI-sref directive. The UI-sref directive specifies a state. Clicking the link activates that state. We'll see how to use UI-sref when we create the menu for the application, which is coming up next. Notice that the first technique uses the state URL fragment identifier. The other 2 techniques use the state name.